Hey, Deserving listeners, this is Chapter 2 in our deep dive on modern Nazis or neo-Nazis or contemporary white supremacy. Let's get into it. What do you say, Berto?
Let's do it.
This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk and Humberto. I'm a therapist and a professor.
My name is Humberto Castañeda, and I use toothpicks as sailboats.
Okay, so before getting to your outline, Berto, and following the story of how we are here today, because you last chapter went into detail about the
mythological roots of a lot of this ideology.
Right. And so, the Aryan race and all that kind of stuff, really interesting stuff that I didn't know. And so I thought as an intro to this chapter, we would ground ourselves in the here and now.
Yeah.
So in 2017, there was a rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, of neo-Nazis and other groups that are close to neo-Nazis, neo-Confederates, neo-fascists, white nationalists, Klansmen, KKK members, far-right militias, these folks all gathered together, various different people, Charlottesville, Virginia, and we could situate it in time and space in that there, like I was talking about in Chapter 1, there's a lot of forces at play, of course, but I think one factor that we can note is that Barack Obama was elected president twice, which would be very threatening to these people for various reasons. And even people that don't consider themselves to be neo-Nazis were potentially threatened by this because of their ideology of racism. And then Donald Trump gets elected, and it could be argued that he got elected, at least in part, because he was overt about his racism.
Borders specifically are a very big part of modern nationalist and, traditionally nationalist movements.
Right.
Borders are very important. Ironically, borders were not respected and invasions did happen, but in World War II and whatnot. But the point is that your national pride, your national identity without borders and without control of who lives there is a big deal. And so by the platform of Trump being, hey, we're going to we're going to build this wall.
Yeah.
And we're going to stop those influx.
Yeah.
That goes to at least two key aspects. One, we're going to respect our borders. And that's a key word. It's like one of those little dog whistle words or phrases. And two, we're going to stop mixing, getting so much of a mix of people up in here.
Yeah.
That one wasn't as explicitly stated in the first run, but it was there.
Yeah.
And those two were music to the ears.
Yeah. And it could be implied or even stated by Trump that even brown people or anyone who wasn't of the mainstream as he would see it, even within the borders, even though they were American citizens, would also be potentially under threat, right?
Yes. Obviously, that was the implication. It's just that, remember how many pains he went to include black people in his cabinet and say, I have black friends and I have all these things. And he went to the Jewish fundraisers and he was trying to really be no, I'm cool. Just, we're going to build a wall. We're going to stop the influx of those people from the South.
Yeah.
But he didn't have to be that overt at that point because it was okay, I see what you're saying. I hear you.
Right.
Yeah.
So could be argued that because of that rhetoric and because he was elected, it emboldened people that had felt under attack for some weird ideological reason and also felt as though they were being pushed underground by the majority of Americans who would vote a black person into the office of the President of the United States. And so now that you have Donald Trump, who Make America Great Again and all that stuff, it just appealed to these people. So then another factor is that I think, when you just look at the whole series of events and you think about the system, and of course this is an oversimplification, but you have that developing, and then as Trump becomes president, you have an upswell of activism among liberals and people saying oh my God, Donald Trump is president, we have to mobilize and do something. And one of the things among many that had been worked, there'd been a lot of people working on a number of things for decades and centuries, but one of the things that activists have been trying to change for a long time is to take down these Confederate statues, generals and other people, Confederate generals. Let's take down these statues, or let's not name the
the schools and the roads
and the army bases.
Yeah. Oh, army bases, right?
As well. I mean, Fort Lee, Fort Bragg, these way. And so you have this movement that's been going on for a long time. I'll never forget, I went to, in Memphis, there was a little museum in a house. They just renovated an old house into a museum about slavery and the Underground Railroad, I believe. And we were the only people in the museum. It was this tiny little museum. There's just us and the owner or the worker there.
Curator there.
Yeah. And she was our personal guide. And then as we're walking outside, she points out, and she says, you see that school, or she says down the street there's a school that's named after so-and-so. And she says, do you know who so-and-so is? And I said, no. He's like, well, so-and-so was a slave trader.
Oh.
And 90% of the kids that go to this school are black. But who cares? It's a school in the United States that is named after a slave trader. I think that individual is also in the Confederate Army in the leadership, but still.
Yeah.
And I said to her, as someone from Seattle, a naive person from Seattle, I'm like, well, surely people are going to change the name for that school. And she looked at me and she's like, you do not understand the South.
Yeah.
And I said, I clearly don't, because in Seattle, there are problems, but that thing would be changed so quickly. There wouldn't be much pushback, or if there was, it wouldn't be strong enough. Whereas in Memphis, you have enough pushback. So, so along those lines, 2017 comes along, Trump gets elected, upwelling of activism. Let's do a lot of things, including taking down these statues. And so they were going to take down in Charlottesville, Virginia, this statue, I believe, to Robert E. Lee, who was a Confederate general. So these neo-Nazis said, let's all get together in Charlottesville, Virginia to stop this from happening, but also let's just announce to the world that we exist. And as a recruitment tool, as a way of trying to get to further their political agenda, as a way to build morale. If you don't have these kinds of rallies, then anyone knows that you're, it's sort of like with the podcast, we have to release a certain amount of content, and deep dives over time to keep people's interest. I guess to these folks, their version of a deep dive is a rally. It's a way to like galvanize your fans, I suppose.
By the way, so it's interesting because of course on the surface, like you're saying, the surface motivations, hey, they want to remove the statue. We got to stand up. This is too far. But like you're saying, there was a lot bigger motivation. But one interesting thing is, like, my perspective on the statues and the school names and all these things is, I feel like there has to be some sort of statute of limitations. And I might be wrong about that. But the reason I feel that way is because a lot of the stuff that is named around the world is named from horrific past things.
Yeah. Like District of Columbia, or
church,
the Columbia River,
the country of Columbia,
British Columbia,
the country of Columbia. Anywhere you go where there's a church, like that was built on blood. Anywhere where you go where there is like a monument to something, that was built on blood, and some of them are like massacres. Well, so,
it's different. And certainly I agree with you. But changing a name or taking down a statue is so easy.
Right. It is easy. What I'm wondering, though, is at which point it cuts both ways. Like, at which point removing it rubs the wrong itch, because as an example, like, the founding fathers of this country also owned slaves. So you could imagine folks saying, like, okay, we're going to take down Mount Rushmore. We're going to take down all these things. And technically you could see, well, yeah, that's true.
But to me, that is different. But I would hear that. I'm not precious about that kind of history. You know what I mean? Like, if people want to take down Thomas Jefferson from Mount Rushmore, I'd be like, what do I care?
But the extremes are like you see in the Middle East when they demolished 2,000-year-old temples.
So I don't know what their reasons were, but if their reasons...
Whatever their reasons, I guarantee you those temples were bloody and built on blood too.
Okay.
But...
so to me... And of course, case-by-case basis. But the Confederate statues are such an easy thing to take down. The generals had power, and a lot of them had a huge stake in this war. They had plantations.
Yeah.
Some of the army bases in the United States were named after men who had thousands of slaves.
Right. And I think it's easy to agree with all that. It's also easy to agree that there are things that were even more horrific that we're still keeping around because they're historic. But my point is, like, I don't have the answer. I'm just wondering, at which point do we have to be like, yeah, history is horrible, but let's just leave this stuff alone and move forward? And I don't know if that's 200 years or 300 years, or if it varies by depending on how horrific the thing was. Like, certainly right now, no one in their right mind, well, actually, a lot of people right now, because of what we're discussing, would, but most people around the world wouldn't erect a Hitler statue, right? And certainly it's not something anyone would. But I could imagine a Genghis Khan statue somewhere. You know, like there probably are Genghis Khan monuments or something. I don't know. Like,
well,
right?
That would be questionable.
I could imagine an Alexander the Great statue. I could imagine, in fact, we have tons of Greek statues and things. We have things from the Bible that were tied to, according to the same book, massacres. My point is, like, some point, is it 1,000 years, 2,000, 200 years?
I think
20 years?
I think.
Do we demolish all of history?
Alexander the Great was a very effective killer of people.
Yeah.
And because he fought for a particular country, and then a bunch of countries who sort of identify with Macedonia and Greece as a general culture, whenever they make a movie about Alexander the Great or about ancient Rome, guess what accent they have? They're British. They're British. Yeah. Why is that?
Well, it sounds dignified.
Because British people and Americans identify with them, because they want to identify with them, because they were powerful.
Yeah.
And so it's just the story that we tell ourselves, and looked at from a different. And I'm sure there are people today who have history books who paint Alexander the Great in a very different light.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think all those things should be called into question. But I'm not saying that an entire cathedral should just be bulldozed to the ground necessarily.
But you could see the argument.
But I could see the argument, but I could also see how renaming it or acknowledging the history, right?
Yes.
So, but a statue to Robert E. Lee and other even worse generals, because Robert E. Lee was, in terms of the ranking of horrific generals regarding what we're talking about, Robert E. Lee wasn't at the top of the list. He was on there, but he wasn't top of the list. And so you have all these generals, they're sitting on their horse with a sword, and they look regal. Like, this is a celebration of this man and what they stood for. It's not just an acknowledgement of history or an acknowledgement of what the reality was and what they were fighting for and what they knew they were fighting for. So if you want to acknowledge history, let's do it. But if we want to elevate genocidal racists who owned thousands of humans and harmed them and ripped them away from their parents and sold, because some of them would have kids.
Oh, totally.
And they'd rip the kids away and just, and beat them and lynch them. Like, I don't think they should have like a monument that makes them look great. I think it should put them in context.
And I agree with you. I agree with that. And at the same time, we do that for all these horrible mass murdering psychopath civilizations.
And I don't think we should.
But if we go down that route, I think we would be left with very little antiquity.
Well, case by case basis. That's my point. And Alexander the Great would absolutely be on the chopping block. I mean, look at what he did. Yeah. Did he have to kill all the way across Persia and India?
It's easy to say that. Right? It's just that they were all doing it. All the leaders at that time were doing it.
And I think they were all wrong.
Yeah. In retrospect, nowadays, that would be horrific.
But there were other civilizations that weren't necessarily doing it as fervently as they were.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I mean, again, like, I'm certainly not arguing, like, let's erect an Alexander the Great statue. It's more about, like, actually, I look at it like we should know history. We should learn from it. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, if the Library of Alexandria were still around, I wouldn't be voting to either rename it nor tear it down.
No, me neither.
But someone could make that argument.
Yeah. And I would listen to it.
Yeah.
I don't know where I don't.
Right.
I mean, I wouldn't say
And so
burn the whole thing down. I would
Right.
say maybe it. Like with Britain right now,
Yeah.
for the past number of decades, they're dealing with the fact that they
Have a
through
monarchy.
and through their
sorry.
colonization, they've been just stealing and absorbing all sorts of art and artifacts.
The British Museum is full of Egyptian stuff.
So
Yeah.
do we burn the museum? No, we send it back.
Yeah.
We return it. That's the right way. Alexandria, you could argue, the knowledge and all the scrolls that were sitting in there were I don't know, maybe the argument would be that it was somehow a part of the genocide or the harm to group, I don't know. But that knowledge deserves to live maybe somewhere. Maybe it's not called Alexandria. Maybe it's called the library of the peoples that were harmed. But I don't know what the argument would be.
Look,
But
there is a different category that I think could be brought up, which is because by the way, just to be clear, like I have no love lost for any of those statues or people or whatever. The only reason I liked the Dukes of Hazzard when I was a kid is because it was a fun show and I had no context about anything. But what I will say is that there's also a categorical difference between statues that were actually erected fairly recently by essentially complete white supremacists to essentially do to foment a new ideology and to do propaganda and have no actual historical artistic they're not, well, this was Michelangelo's piece or something. A lot of the things that I'm referring to do have a lot of more artistry to it or historical value and things like that. So I'm way less sympathetic to those statues in question, but I'm bringing it up because at some point, all of us are standing on a foundation built on massacre and blood, and we benefit from it.
yeah.
And so I'm not as quick to be like, rename everything and tear everything down, because I don't know if it's as valuable to do so as it might appear.
Is there an example? Because I don't know of anyone that's saying burn everything down and rename everything.
There are some more extreme leftists that would want to demolish all the founding father stuff, demolish all that is. And I would say, I don't know that that's helpful, to some extent. I do believe that what's helpful is teaching the history as accurately as we have it, and not burning the books and not banning the books and really actually making clear what happened. I think that's super valuable.
To me, my American identity is such that if you tore down Mount Rushmore, if you took down, I don't know, the Jefferson Monument in the Mall in Washington,
And the Lincoln Memorial and all this stuff.
Yeah. Lincoln Memorial could stay.
Why?
Well, I mean, I think there's enough reason through my understanding, that his monument deserves to be there. Jefferson has, value as well, but there's obviously a lot of problems. If you don't know, it's well understood that he had many, many slaves, hundreds of slaves. It's now proven through DNA that he had been, I don't know if we say rape or he was having relations with his slaves, his women slaves who gave birth to children, and through their descendants and DNA analysis, they can figure out that indeed that did happen.
Yeah. Where I would land would be like, at some point, I'm going to cut off the line and say, look, let's just leave the damn thing up. We can actually learn about it. The tour guide can tell us all about the horrible things.
But here's the other thing. Like, to me, America there are still symbols like the Statue of Liberty, for example. Is it tainted with a lot of trouncing upon the liberties of people around the world and including our own citizens? Yes. But the ideal, I just bumped into my own microphone, but the ideal of liberty and what it stands for and the image that it has, not only to us, but to everyone around the world, it was put there because that's where a lot of the immigrants were coming to Ellis Island.
And even though I don't know the full history.
So for me, the Statue of Liberty is worth staying. The Jefferson Monument and Mount Rushmore, if I'm looking for something to hold up as something that represents what I believe to be the American identity, there are certain things that I don't need, and there are certain things that I would want to keep.
Right. And that makes sense. And then this country is very young by those standards. But realize we already demolished any remaining Native American temple or whatever. That's all gone. So we don't even get to have that discussion. But when you go to Europe, you do then have all these castles and you have all these other things. Those castles were ruled by people that killed constantly and pillaged and blah, blah, blah. So I'm choosing to draw a line at some point and saying, look, history is brutal and horrible by our modern standards. Yeah. I'm saying we're going to cut off the line somewhere. Maybe it's the last 100 years or something.
No, I don't think it's time. I think it's what it symbolizes. So to those castles, what is the history? Because not every castle has the same history. And
I guarantee you every single castle
oppressed,
was not poor people.
Oppressed, the poor. But also, what does it symbolize to the people, right? What does it mean to the people? If a castle means oppression of poor people, then that's what it means. Then maybe tear it down. But if it means something else, or if everyone understands.
Okay. So that I could get behind that. So if the Statue of Lee to most people in the area symbolizes like the good old days when I'm not going to name it, but we had better situation, blah, blah, then that's got to go.
Yeah.
But if it symbolizes like it's just a piece of history, we actually teach classes, we actually let you know that maybe it's not. I would get behind that philosophy personally, because then it would be more consistent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I don't know.
That said, I have zero problem with people taking down the statue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the statue in Charlottesville, Virginia was being at least talked about in terms of its removal. Maybe it had even been identified officially as being removed. I don't know the full story, but the neo-Nazi groups descended upon Charlottesville, Virginia, and they called it the Unite the Right Rally 2017. So I looked into this, and the journalists who looked into it found that on Discord, they had been planning this event and many other events. That's this Discord channel. Do you call them channels?
Yeah.
Or servers? Discord servers.
It's a channel too.
Yeah. Well, there's channels within the servers. Anyway, on Discord, there's a lot of discussion among these neo-Nazis, and they had been planning a lot of things, including this Unite the Right rally. And on the Discord, apparently it's available to journalists because it's digital, or Discord handed it over, or someone leaked it, or, who knows. But the journalists were describing it, and they were talking about how in the Discord they talk about like what weapons to bring and how to make their violence because they were planning on being violent, how to make their violence look like self-defense so they can get away with it. Also, there were discussions about like how to pack sandwiches because you'll get hungry.
Yeah.
And what about people who need gluten-free? Like stuff like this,
Yeah. Hey, that is not proper. The pure Nazi specimen doesn't have these little ailments where they need this no gluten and stuff like that.
Is that true? You're just...
No, I'm serious. Like,
oh, really?
That you would want to phase that out of the population.
Oh,
That's
I see.
a weakness.
I see. Okay.
Well,
they were apparently... So
the other thing they were discussing, it was very explicit, because you got to wonder, like, why was the march at night? Like, isn't it harder to see at night? Like, you got to carry the torches, like, right? But they learned from the Nazis, for real, is that the spectacle is at least half the point. And imagine the difference between seeing a whole bunch of, dudes walking around in the middle of the day, just walking.
Yeah. Let's just say... not the most photogenic group.
Yeah. At night, with the torches lit up, it's a movie scene. And they're all like, we will not, whatever, right? You will not replace.
It's funny, though, but they have tiki torches, which I always associate with
with more like a luau or something.
with like Mai Tais.
But that's on purpose.
Yeah.
But no, there is a significance.
Oh.
The luau boys, we'll talk about a lot of the symbology.
I can't tell when you're joking.
No, I'm not kidding.
This is real?
This is real.
The luau boys.
The luau has a significance. All of these things, a lot of this started on 4chan.
Wow.
And it has layers, dude. But my point is that it was a spectacle that was memorable. You see all that. It instills fear. The fire at night, all that fire. Plus, it looks way more massive than it actually was, right? Like, during the day, if you see 100 people walking, it's like, oh, man. At night, 100 torches lit up in the,
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so at the rally, they carried these tiki torches that have to do with the luau boys. I can't wait to learn about that. And they carried Nazi and neo-Nazi symbols, Confederate flags, swastikas. I had no idea how many neo-Nazi symbols there were. It's like Dungeons and Dragons or Game of Thrones. It's like there's all these different symbols that have to do with like real silly things and myths about this and that. Anyway, so there's all these different flags, and they chanted racist and anti-Semitic slogans. They carried weapons. The organizers said that their goal was to unify the America white nationalist movement into one grand unit. And they also opposed the removal of Confederate monuments, right? So the event turned violent, as they were hoping it would, and a neo-Nazi participating in the rally, I don't know if it was the second day, like the day after, he, in his car, plowed into a crowd of peaceful counter-protesters, people who were protesting against Nazis. And I also don't know this specifically, but the way that it looked to me, where the car was plowing through the people, because I've seen a lot of different footage of it, both from drones and other people.
Yeah.
It wasn't like the counter protesters, people that we would be with. These would be our people. That they didn't look like they were anywhere near the neo-Nazis. It was like it was during the daytime.
Yeah.
They were in a little town kind of square. There's like buildings.
It was
around.
like indiscriminate.
Well, my point is that there was a lot of violence going on because the neo-Nazis and the counter-protesters were each inciting violence. In some ways, the neo-Nazis were going after the counter-protesters, but also the counter-protesters were physically going after the neo-Nazis. But in this instance, the car plowing through the people, it was just a group of counter-protesters. The way it looks, they weren't near or they weren't threatening. It wasn't like the guy plowing through the crowd was trying to protect his people.
Nope.
He was just going in there to murder and hurt people. Yeah. And so he plowed through the crowd, and many were injured, 35 people. And Heather Heyer, she died. She was one of the counter-protesters. And also some journalists will attribute the death of 2 police officers to this event as well, because they were responding via helicopter and the helicopter crashed.
Oh, okay.
So you could argue that the 2 police officers also died because of this. So I thought we would watch some of the footage, Berto. Let's watch it now. And again, trigger warning, because this whole series is going to have this kind of material. It's hard to watch.
Jews will not replace us! Blood and soil! 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 Blood and soil!
So, Berto, do you know what they mean by blood and soil?
Oh, yeah.
What does that mean?
Yeah, so because these aren't just pretending to have Nazi ideology. So blood and soil is directly lifted from the Nazi ideology. The soil part is the nationalistic aspect. This is where I was talking about borders being important. The soil represents like we have a land. This land is ours, right? So it's even more, I'd say, how shall I say, like in the U.S. modern neo-Nazi movements and a lot of the movements, that land and the borders are even more important. But it was certainly important in Germany, like the Germany land, the ancestral land, blah, blah, that was important. And then the blood, of course, is the purity of the race.
So do these neo-Nazis in the United States believe that they are members of the Aryan superior magical god race? That
I don't know if they still adhere to any of like the superstition of the Atlantis and stuff we were discussing. But do they believe that the race, the Aryan race, is superior? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And they believe that through all sorts of pseudoscientific means, as well as I'm sure religious means too.
Yeah, when there'll be an interview that will kind of get at that, where they believe white people of a certain ilk to be superior, just full stop. They have better morals. They have better behavior.
They're smarter. They have higher IQ.
They're smarter.
They've done more throughout history. Just like the works.
Yeah.
You name it,
yeah,
it's proven.
Right.
You know.
Okay, let's watch more of this.
12 hours from our car. We've been driving from north of the border, so.
Oh, you came down from Canadistan. If I was doing the radical agenda in Canada, I'd probably be arrested for it, right?
Yeah, well, in Canada, hurting people's feelings is basically illegal. I mean, it's not really criminal, but
unless they're white males.
So what do you think of that, Berto?
Yeah, so a couple things stand out. First of all, the chanting of White Lives Matter.
Which I may or may not have included in the clip.
You know, it's so unfortunate because any little openings, this is one of the challenges with when one side is just kind of trying to live their lives and then do mostly good, but they mess up, they do mistakes and stuff. And another side is always looking for any slight mistakes or deviations, or even just openings, any opening, and they'll pounce on it.
Yeah.
So the saying could have been, Black lives also matter. But because it's just abbreviated and catchier to say Black lives matter, which to any rational person in the world only makes sense. Like, yeah, dude, Black lives matter, for crying out loud. They're like, oh, so you're saying only Black lives matter? No, no one ever said that, but you're saying. So now we're going to protest because what about white lives? White lives matter. It's just so sad that because a lot of the folks that end up chanting and going that direction, they're actually just manipulated. But the inceptors of the idea are so cynical about it.
Yeah.
That they actually are pretending like, what about white lives? You know,
Yeah.
Don't those matter?
Yeah.
And so that comes to mind. And then the second part right there where it's like, oh yeah, you know, in Canada, it's a crime to hurt someone's feelings unless you're a white male. And then that's the victim mentality, which is always so ironic because they're always accusing the left of being the snowflakes and being like always victimized, like they're always victims.
Right.
But they're always talking about how they're the worst treated people on earth, especially the males. The white males are the worst treated people on earth.
Yeah, it's sort of like whenever there's this pushback on including Christian symbols in federal buildings like Christmas time, it's a war on Christmas. And it's like, I don't think Christmas is going to lose because Christmas is everywhere.
Yeah.
It's not going anywhere either. So this tiny, you're so victimized that we can't have Christian religion symbols in a government building.
I mean, this is why I was saying that they look for any in. For example.
Well, they also always believe they're being victimized. And I think they legitimately believe that. Right.
So, for example, you can't say Merry Christmas anymore. Okay. So they take a legitimate thing, which is like, hey, actually, if you indiscriminately always only say Merry Christmas to everyone, statistically, you're bound to be saying Merry Christmas to some folk that actually don't celebrate Christmas. Some folk that might celebrate Hanukkah or other holidays, or maybe don't celebrate anything. So what do? Well, we do, like, this time of year is festive for most people. So how about we arrive at happy holidays? Doesn't mean you can't wish a Merry Christmas to folks that you're pretty sure celebrate Christmas. But can we just, like, if you're doing it randomly to maybe a coworker or someone you've never really met, just say happy holidays. It kind of catches it all.
Yeah. Or you are a government organization or institution or official representing the people, not just the Christian people.
So then you take that and you're like, aha. You're canceling Christmas. Christmas is now outlawed.
Yeah.
So now we got to save, because it's the war on Christmas. We got to save Christmas. Yeah. And luckily, Trump did manage to bring back saying Merry Christmas. So, now we finally can say it.
Yeah. So this interview is pretty interesting. This El Reeve of Vice News interviews one of the leaders of the neo-Nazi movement and of the Unite the Right rally.
The Trayvon Martin case happened, Michael Brown and Tamir Rice and all these different things happen. Every single case, it's some little black asshole behaving like a savage, and he gets himself in trouble, shockingly enough. Whatever problems I might have with my fellow white people, they generally are not inclined to such behavior.
Thoughts?
Yeah. So this is another very common sidestep, which is, listen, I'm not racist. I think, people, whatever. But you gotta admit, like, those people on those camera footage, they were behaving like, what word could I use? Savages. I could have used any word, but they were behaving like savages. And if you behave like a savage, what do you expect? You should be killed immediately.
Well, specifically, he's talking about Trayvon Martin.
Right. If you behave like a savage, you should be killed immediately. Now, the white people I know, they don't behave like that word, like savages. Like, if they did, which they don't, well then, same rules should apply. So I'm going to read a quote that I'm going to give context to later in our series. If you know the quote, don't spoil it. Please, trigger alert, skip 2 minutes or something, because to believe that the displaced person is a human being, which he is not, and this applies particularly to Jews who are lower than animals. What a quote, right? Okay. So I'm not going to give you the context because we'll talk about this later. But that symbolizes a problem. And the problem is that when you make these groups in your mind and you assign these attributes to those groups, then you literally start looking at the members of those groups as no longer humans, as no longer part of your group. And now you can ascribe anything to them. So as soon as this savage is walking along by themselves at night, totally legitimately, because you've already done the mental gymnastics to assign that group this subhuman animal status, anything they do is now subhuman and subject to the consequences that a savage is subject to.
Right. Like they're a rodent and they're up to no good. Like,
well, but it's not, that's the thing. The and is unnecessary. Rodents are always up to no good.
Right.
When would you not put a rat trap out?
Right.
Would you ask the rat first, are you going to eat my cheese? No. You put the cheese on the trap because they always eat the cheese.
Right.
All rodents are bad. So, savage as a savage does.
Let's continue watching this.
Oklahoma City.
Okay, so exactly. You have to go back to Oklahoma City to talk about a white act of terrorism,
Elliot Roger,
right?
Dylan Roof.
Okay, so now you've managed to name 3 people, and I'm pretty sure Elliot Roger wasn't explicitly white, by the way. But the thing is, you remember the names of white bombers and mass shooters, okay? Yeah. Can you tell me the name of all 19 hijackers on 9/11 off the top of your head?
So it is kind of weird that she said Elliot Roger and Dylan Roof. Dylan Roof, yes, but Elliot Roger?
I guess I don't find it that weird because he's
half Asian.
Yeah, but I'm
just saying he's not like a quintessential example.
Oh, was her example of white terrorists?
Well,
is that, sorry, I guess I missed that part.
She brought up, I think she was making a point of, well, what about these people?
Well, but I mean, if they can call Obama black and then attribute all the bad things to him, why can't we call Elliot Roger white and attribute all the bad things to him?
I'm just saying, but I'm saying if you're going to have things at the ready, I would say there's a different set. Dylan Roof, yes, but Elliot Roger, obviously a horrific human being, but harder to land squarely within the movement of neo-Nazism. You know what I mean?
But all you need at the ready, or if you were going to do that in that moment, are the FBI statistics on homeland terrorism and the demographics of such over the last 30 years.
Yeah. Right.
Period.
Right. So, and the Elliot Rodgers story is more a story of misogyny.
Right. And if you want to talk about why do we know the names, I'll tell you why we know the names. Because they're white males. That's why we know their names, and we don't know the names of the hijackers. Because no one cares about people in this country that are not white in that context. Like, basically, essentially, he's making one of our points in that statement. How come we know the names of them? Because they get glorified as well. These white male killers get glorified too.
Right.
And parentheses, it's not good to know their names. I don't want to know the names of the hijackers either. I don't want to glorify the names of any murderers that go on these murderous crusades to kill lots of people. No one.
Yeah.
Period.
You can remember Dylan Roof's name. You can remember Tim McVeigh's
white
name.
people were capable of violence.
I didn't say capable. Of course we're capable. I'm carrying a pistol. I go to the gym all the time. I'm trying to make myself more capable of violence. I'm here to spread ideas, talk, in the hopes that somebody more capable will come along and do that. Somebody like Donald Trump who does not give his daughter to a Jew.
So I've watched this interview already. I have no idea what he's talking about. I mean, I know what he's talking about in terms of I want a strong leader. That's what a lot of these, I didn't realize that a lot of the neo-Nazis who are committing crimes and terrorism, similar to Charlie Manson, are trying to start a race war.
Yeah, absolutely. Or die trying. Because ultimately, they don't think they'll lose, but they're willing to martyr.
So that's what he wants, and he knows or thinks that he can't be that leader. They want an Adolf Hitler too, second coming, and he just said Donald Trump. So this is back in 2017. Right. This is before the car plows through everybody, and this is their whole reason for doing this. Is like they're trying to show their support so that maybe Donald Trump will step into that role.
They were still ambivalent on Trump.
Okay.
Because I said,
they didn't know yet.
Well, like I said before, Trump, even though he had the best quote unquote advisors next to him telling him the things to say to appeal to these folk, he was still wishy-washy on some fronts. And You heard him. He's got a son-in-law who's a Jew.
So explain this to me. What was he referring to there?
Jared Kushner,
He's Jewish?
Jewish.
Okay, I didn't know that.
And so that has
And Jared
already...
Kushner is married to who?
Ivanka Trump, his
Okay.
daughter. So because he let his daughter marry a Jew, that already calls into question the whole thing.
Oh.
Now, this is the fascinating thing to me. If I were running the neo-Nazi movement, the first thing I would do is like, listen, we're going to rename ourselves. We're going to eliminate all the Nazi stuff. But why? I know, but shut the F up about it. You're stupid. No one's going to support the Nazi stuff right now. So, A.
I like how you have to speak their language,
Yeah.
be macho.
Oh, sorry. Well, what about, okay. And then the next thing is like, and here's the thing. We're going to cool it with the whole Jewish thing. What? But that's the main, I know, the Bilderbergers and stuff. Listen, do you want to win the battles we want right now, or do you want to just like fight every battle on every front? This is the thing that I don't get, because they're sitting there. They do want to legitimately close the borders. They don't want the influx of Mexicans. They all these things, right? But they're still also trying to fight all the other battles at the same time, including with the Jews. The Jews are such a minority in this country, right? And even if they were like really concerned about how much Hollywood they own and stuff like that, it's like, dude, don't you have bigger battles to fight? Now, lucky for us, they spread themselves so thin. And lucky for us, they're still like, the Jews control the world and stuff, because it makes it easier to mock and ridicule. But man, like, what the heck?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of things. I think one is that they've been indoctrinated, so they believe what they believe. And they...
Sorry, yes, but I'm questioning the indoctrinators. Like, why are they indoctrinated?
Well, I don't think there's an indoctrinator. I think that culture and just the movements of society, when they look, I don't think I realized until this deep dive that, of course, they would be attracted to Hitler and the Nazis because there's never been another government, military, nationalistic, fascist power that was so in line with the way that they think.
Right.
It's a whole country, a whole government, and their uniforms look evil and cool. When like
Ego boss.
like Starship Troopers, when you're trying to
Right.
adorn a group of militaristic, nationalistic, somewhat dangerous or very dangerous group of people, you look to the Nazis, their uniforms, just the stuff they walked around in, and also they had the best tanks and they had the best scientists, they had the fighter jets before the Allies did.
Yeah.
They could have had the atomic bomb, but of course they couldn't because they were relying on Jewish, physicists. So it's a very attractive group. It's like we almost had it, is what they would think. And the power and the influence and the look and the symbolism and the point of view, it just justifies everything, because I think for you and me, we tend to think more independently. Like if we have an idea or there's a scientific or philosophic idea, yeah, there might be a group of people, but we will evaluate on a case-by-case basis. And I'm not saying that we're not susceptible to social movements.
No,
that's
total
ridiculous.
bias, absolutely.
Well, I guess one way to look at it is that our point of view must be so mainstream, especially in Seattle, that we don't feel under attack, so we don't need to adhere to some sort of group because we are the group, I guess, in Seattle.
And actually, to that point, we do actually feel a little under attack at times by some of the more extreme cancel culture and more extreme, like puritanical leftist ideology.
Yeah.
And when that happens, we actually do start exhibiting some signs of like, well, wait a minute, we got to push against this, right?
Yeah.
But it's minor compared to what we're talking about.
Well, yeah, but you and I, we don't adhere to some outside philosophical movement or group or mythology. And again, it could either be because we're just swimming in the soup and we don't see it, or we're not under threat, so we don't feel that need. I think that the anti-Semitism bit is that for you and me, we didn't grow up in a community that was overtly anti-Semitic. I remember some things being said, but it wasn't.
So my dad was, and probably is, but definitely was, extremely anti-Semitic.
Oh.
And Colombian society at the time, probably still now, was anti-Semitic.
Oh.
Yeah.
Weird. Okay.
It's just that there were such few Jews, at least comparatively, that...
I mean, did your dad bring it up very often?
Oh, yeah.
Oh. Why?
Because he worked in a Jewish hospital in Maimonides Hospital in New York after Columbia.
Oh, well, you lived in New York for a while,
Yeah.
so.
Oh, and then in Columbia, he'd bring it up all the time.
Oh, okay, well.
I mean, all the time, as in frequently enough that I remember him railing against the Jews.
Okay, well, I'll speak for myself that I didn't grow up around very many Jewish people. I think I knew one Jewish family, so there wasn't much of that. But when I step outside of my community and I hear from people from other parts of the United States, other parts of the world, I realize that it's a frequent topic of conversation for people. Just what the Jews are up to and how much they control the world, or that Jewish shop owner is always trying to cheapskate me or whatever. There's this frequent conversation around it, and every time I step into that, I'm like, oh yeah, I forget that anti-Semitism is in a lot of communities that go back hundreds of years. So when you are a group, one, you've been indoctrinated into that. Two, you need to adhere to some powerful group because you're this tiny little enclave of people that no one else really agrees with outside of your small group. So you need, the Third Reich to look to as just like some model of like power and legitimacy. And also, so you've been indoctrinated into that. Plus, strategically, if you highlight anti-Semitism, there's a shocking amount of people who believe these things. People that you and I might even be friends with.
Yeah.
Like if we really held all of our friends, to the questions.
What do you actually believe? Hey, you're just friends here. What do you?
Tell me all your thoughts about Jewish people. Undoubtedly,
you'd probably be surprised to find that. Yeah,
like I had a friend years ago that he would never have indicated anything like this. He said something like, "Well, I'm not to be anti-Semitic, but Jewish people, they do run Hollywood."
Right.
And I was like, "What the fuck?" He's like, "Well, they do, and then they, I'm not being anti-Semitic. They do. They run Hollywood, and." They help each other out. They're on each other's team, and so they get to do whatever they want to. And I'm like, where?
But see, that's an interesting, because what I find is that there are times where you express a reality about the world, something you observe, and you don't have an ulterior motive behind that expression. Like, for example, I could say there's a lot of violence in inner city black neighborhoods. That happens to be true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's also a lot of violence per capita in rural America.
Yeah, absolutely. But it happens to be true. There's a lot of violence in inner city black communities. Now, the question is, why did I bring it up? What is my point?
Right.
And that's where you got to double click.
Yeah.
Because if someone says, hey, there are, in fact, a lot of executives in Hollywood who are Jewish.
Right.
And do they give a hand up to each other? Oh, absolutely. And what is your point?
Right.
And do you know why it might be that Jewish folk had to lean toward arts and other things like that, like lending money, instead of other professions for a long time? Do you know any of that?
Right.
Do you know why communities in black neighborhoods might have it? Do you know? And that's the problem, is that I think it's totally fine in the world to point out facts when you're trying to point out facts for fact reasons or whatever. But when your agenda is, you're trying to support an agenda with factoids.
Right.
Ugh.
So yeah, right. It wasn't the first time that I'd heard someone highlight that there are a lot of Jewish people in entertainment. That wasn't the first time.
Yeah.
But the way that he said it was highlighting the conspiratorial, almost like...
Yeah, well,
almost like this notion that all Jewish people get together in some convention, the secret convention, and make their plans for Hollywood and otherwise. That they just have this ability to coordinate and control everything.
So again, the thing about like looking for a way in. Does a large part of the Jewish community do great things like they actually help when the kids are coming up, they hold bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs, help each other out, they collect money and have funds for the kids. Does that happen? Yeah. Do they do things where as a community they like have things? Yeah, they do all sorts of things. Those are good. We should learn from those kinds of things. More communities should do that. We should all have bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs. When you're saying like, yeah, the Jewish folk, they get together and they like help each other out. That's where the problem starts. Again, it's the agenda hidden behind the statement of fact or factoid or whatever, or
Right.
misrepresented fact or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
That it's nefarious and self-serving, and it's a threat to non-Jewish people.
Oh, because by the way, waspy stockbrokers never give each other a hand.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. All right, let's watch more of this nonsense.
Donald Trump, but like more racist.
A lot more racist than Donald Trump. I don't think that you could feel about race the way I do and watch that Kushner bastard walk around with that beautiful girl, okay?
Okay, so that makes a lot more sense.
Blood and soil, baby. Blood and soil.
I didn't even know what he was talking about last time, but okay.
To get out of today, like what does it mean to you?
Well, for one thing, it means that we're showing to this parasitic class of anti-white vermin that this is our country. This country was built by our forefathers. It's sustained by us. It's going to remain our country. I believe, as you can see.
So in light of chapter 1, where you're talking about blood and soil and all that stuff, it helps
the
me.
word
It helps
vermin.
me. Right. It helps me to interpret what he's saying.
And the
I've
word
seen it-
vermin was specific, right? Because they used the German. I forget how you said it in German. They used that word explicitly in the Nazi propaganda.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just interesting. When I watched this interview earlier, it certainly sounded racist. I mean, it is racist.
Yeah.
But it's almost like you're hearing from a cult member from the other side of some from some weird wall.
Right, and
like,
when you don't know the lingo, you're like, okay, that's racist. That's,
vermin. That's dehumanizing.
Right.
But when you understand the basis for the cult indoctrination, you're like, oh, you're just spouting shit that you all propagandize to each other,
Because once again, vermin are never okay. They're never good. There's never a case where vermin are good.
Right.
The grain needs to be protected at all costs.
Yeah.
So once we have leapt over and said these folks are vermin, they're not folks, they're vermin.
Yeah. He said,
we are ready for any kind of treatment of that vermin.
Yeah, and he also said anti-white because I think they have words like that to highlight, okay, I realize that most of the protesters are white.
Yeah.
So we have to say something. So they're white, but they're anti-white vermin.
Yeah.
They're not, they're along, they're with,
That's a good point. That's a great point. How do you, so in the Germany case, it would have been a dissident or, not supporting the party, right?
Yeah.
Because wait, they're German, they're not Jewish. Why are you killing them? They don't support the party. They're
Right.
dissidents or whatever. So in this case, like, well, they're not what you're saying. They hit. I know, but they're anti-white.
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
We are stepping off the internet in a big way. For instance, last night at the Torch Walk, there were hundreds and hundreds of us. People realize they're not atomized individuals. They're part of a larger whole because we have been spreading our memes. We have been organizing on the internet. And so now they're coming.
So he's talking about that hope that they have about galvanizing and telling all their members, look, we're not just on the internet. We're not atomized. We are a cohesive group and we are going to collaborate together. But I find it funny when he says, we've been sharing our memes. Did you hear him say that?
Yeah, we're sharing our memes.
It's such a funny version of modern Nazi talk,
It is
right?
propaganda. The memes are propaganda.
Yeah, but
I know, but it is funny to hear it that way. I do just, I feel such sadness because can you imagine the amount of hurt inside of this person?
Yeah. So later we're going to watch some clips of individuals who have extracted themselves from Nazi cults and tell us, and journalists, why they entered it. And my conclusion is, and then we're going to talk at some point down the road, we're going to go into the psychology of all the different factors that I can think of as to why someone would get to this point.
And they were a child.
And it's not a road of happiness.
No, they were a little child, a little baby at some point.
Yeah.
And now they're in this place where they hate. And
And so similarly, we should not be dehumanizing them.
No.
We should not be calling them words that are our version of vermin,
And
which
I
I think does happen.
And this is a preview of coming end attractions, but I wish that the best would happen to these folk. Not the best by their terms, I guess,
Right.
but the best as in like that they got more money and I guess not more money to do the things. But I just wish that happy things happened to them in their life a lot. Good experiences and so that they just like, We have it okay in this life, in this time of history, in this fucking country, with these riches.
Yeah. There's so many good things we could be doing.
We are using tablets and the internet to talk about how much oppression we are experiencing.
Yeah. Memes.
Yeah.
And now, as you can see today, we greatly outnumbered the anti-white, anti-American filth. And at some point, we will have enough power that we will clear them from the streets forever. That which is degenerate in white countries will be removed.
So the first time I saw this interview, at the beginning, it was just kind of typical neo-Nazi rhetoric. But then that ending bit is chilling, because you don't usually hear them say that to journalists.
Right.
And of course, I would imagine they would say this behind closed doors, but even then, it's chilling. Like they're talking about genocide, openly.
I don't know if you
They're
remember.
not talking about borders anymore.
No,
they're talking about eradicating these people.
The blood part of the blood.
Yeah, he's not talking about displacing. Yeah. He's talking about killing.
I don't know if you remember. There was an infamous interview back a long time ago with a KKK Grand Wizard or Grand Poobah, whatever. With actually one of the interviewers was Pat Buchanan, who is right wing as you can get. But in this interview, he was coming off as like the voice of reason, because he was actually pushing back on the KKK dude. But the amazing thing is that even then, or at least then, the KKK guy had a lot of layers of subterfuge. So, for example, he was like, "No, I don't hate." I don't hate the blacks. He was saying, I do believe that the communities should be segregated. Like, we should live over here, but I don't want to do them harm. I just think we should be segregated. We'd all be happier. Like, and I don't know if that's truly how he felt, but that was the dialogue was about like, no, I don't. This is that Hitlerian level. Like, oh no.
Yeah.
Oh no.
Yeah. I've seen those kinds of interviews as well in my life on this planet. And I think my conclusion is that that's just what they're telling the journalists. Yeah. Because if you're going to be that adamant, your whole life is organized around this notion,
right. Yeah.
then you
have way more than what.
Yeah.
But my point
you're not, because if you really were just like, I just want, a community of white people, there are plenty of communities where it's literally all white. Yeah. So you can have that. But why is your entire life oriented around this idea? Well, it's because you really believe they're vermin and you're trying to get rid of them.
But my point is that I think it's getting so dangerous because then, which I probably was in the 70s, they had to hide it in public.
Yeah.
They had to wear a hood and they had to say those things in public interviews. This guy is presumably free to walk around hoodless all day long and say it to anyone that will listen.
Yeah, and I wonder if he's not only emboldened by the current circumstances of the rally, being in the midst of everybody, just sort of energized and feeling free, but also with the echo chamber online. The average KKK member 30 years ago still had to go to the store and interact with regular people, would only be able to talk to other KKK members in these clandestine meetings.
Yeah, you couldn't send memes around, literally. You couldn't.
I just find it funny that this guy's talking about memes. But for the average neo-Nazi leaning individual today, it's 24/7.
I will make a parenthesis that we will cover in the propaganda side of the section, because the meme thing, as funny as it sounds, is a huge part of this underculture.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah. Well, I didn't know that, but okay, let's watch some more of this.
Because they don't want our speech, because we're telling the truth. We're talking about the ethnic cleansing of America and the destruction of the American way of life and a new Bolshevik-style society with no freedom of speech in this country. That's really where we're going in America, and that's got to change.
So for those of you who don't know who this individual is, his name is David Duke, and one of the very first sort of heavy metal-y songs I ever wrote was called Duke, because I was so angry at him.
How did you know so much about him?
Well, because in in the 80s
there was a lot of
late 80s, early 90s, there was a lot of talk about him because So for those
Well, I was in Colombia, so maybe that's why I didn't hear as much about
So
it.
in the 70s, so Black Klansman, for example, the character played by Topher Grace is David Duke, who was a Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. We understand that there are various members and leaders within the KKK, but this individual, David Duke, was an elected official to the Louisiana House of Representatives for the Republican Party from 1989 to 1992. Before that, though, in 1988, he was running for the Democratic presidential nomination, which is bizarre. But I think that's a remnant of how things were flipped in the South in the past.
Yeah.
But anyway, so that's what I remember him from, is that there was a lot of media attention in the 88 election. And I just remember being astonished that a KKK, I mean, I knew KKK members existed because I'd seen Geraldo and other kinds of shows, they would highlight these folks. But the fact that he had support, that people were standing behind him, and that he was just out in the open, and he was known and admitting, I used to be Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. I'm just like, how is this happening? And I'm not saying it was a good song, Berto, that I wrote, but it was a very fun song to play, and we would play it in college.
Did it include expletives?
You know what? I wonder if I have the lyrics. Indulge me, Berto, for a second while I look up.
What if we're horrified to find your lyrics are like, I actually really like David Duke.
Okay, so I'm not saying it's a good song, but and think of like a hard sort of punky beat with loud guitars and stuff and dissonant chords.
Dissident?
Dissonant, sorry.
Yeah.
Dissonant
I thought you said
chords.
dissident.
I think
was like,
I did.
That's appropriate.
Yeah. You are white, but who really cares when you are shit and teach your children to hate their brother and themselves? Wrap the little ones in white. Give them hoods to wear. Put a shotgun in one hand and a rope to tie up their brother and themselves. Hey, you Duke, you're the one. You are done. It's not a great.
I'm liking it. I know it's a little early. Kirk. Not Kirk.
What are you afraid of? Can't you hang with them? Look at yourself. You are white. Kill me. I'm yellow. I am bad. Kill me. It's sort of a screamy song. It's not like a very subtle.
I applaud it, man.
Subtle lyric, but anyway, I hadn't sweat yet until that happened. Something about reading those lyrics is very vulnerable to me. But anyway, so all right, let's wait to watch the car attack in chapter 3.
Okay.
So tell us what in the patron zone you're going to cover, Berto.
Yeah, we're gonna keep going with a little bit more of the background of Nazism, because it's a whole ideology that spans decades, really thousands of years, and it's got a lot of impacts throughout society. So in the next sections, we're going to talk about philosophy, the impact that Nietzsche, is that how you say it? Nietzsche had. Darwinism, science, the impact that science had.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And psychology, the impact that psychologists had.
Yeah. Phrenology, is that thrown in there at all? I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm excited to learn about that. So if you want to hear the second portion of chapter 2, become a patron of the podcast. So, Berto, if you were to write a song when you were young and maybe not as good at writing lyrics about
That was terrible, yeah.
about people becoming a patron of the podcast, I'll play piano with one hand.
These are bad lyrics, young Berto, bad lyrics about becoming a patron.
Yeah.
Okay.
Ready?
You deserve it to someone, because this life sucks and life will drain you of everything, and your mom and daddy too. But you can't escape it because you have a friend in psychology in Seattle. So become a patron! Woo!
The dogs are barking. So become a patron, and then you can hear every episode of this deep dive and every deep dive that we do. So if this is where we depart for chapter 2, please take care of yourself. Why should people take care of themselves, Brandon?
Because you deserve it.